Well, nobody likes when things are limp, especially when it's your chain. That's pretty floppy, but today we're gonna be talking about chains. So this is about as worn out as it gets, and we're gonna be slapping a new chain and sprockets on the RM back here and explaining the differences between some of these chains. You know, there's X-ring chains, O-ring chains, standard chains, and so let's break it down. So let's talk a bit about what an X-ring chain is. Chang. Sounded like Joe Biden over here. Oh man. So this is an X-ring chain. Now the biggest difference between a seal chain such as an X-ring or O-ring chain and a standard non-seal chain is that a seal chain such as this one here has an O-ring or an X-ring that seals off the inside of the chain. So when it's together, you can see that is a sealed fit, and that protects the inside of the chain from wear from dirt, water, corrosion, rust, anything that can get in there and deteriorate it. And that's essentially what causes a chain to stretch, is when the pins wear out, the chain stretches, and then all of a sudden you have a chain that's floppier than sandals on a fat girl. Now here's that chain I showed in the beginning of the video. This is a standard non-sealed chain. You can see inside of the chain there are no seals at all. And here's an O-ring chain. Inside of there are O-rings. And that is very similar to an X-ring. X-ring is basically the same thing, just has a different shaped ring. And over time, as chains wear out, you'll see some play in the rollers, like this one here. I don't know if you can see it in the video or not, but I can certainly feel it. But when I pull it back and forth, there is a decent amount of play in this chain. So this thing's pretty worn out. Now what a seal chain does differently than a non-seal chain is it seals off the inside bore of the chain as well as this pin. It keeps the grease in there and it keeps out the water and dirt and rust, anything that'll wear things down. So say if you get dirt in there, it'll rub back and forth over time as you're using the chain, and it'll wear down the pin as well as the hole. And then in no time you got a sloppy fit here, and link by link that chain will stretch out. And what a sealed chain does not do is seal off these inside rollers. These are completely open for dirt and water to get in there, which is why it is so important to maintain your chain. These rollers rely on the chain lube you provide in order to stay lubricated. From this view, you can see the seal keeps out the water and dirt from entering into the chain in between the link and the plate. So here I have an X-ring chain that has a ton of hours on it, and the chain itself is fairly tight. There's just a little bit of play in the links, but the rollers are completely shot. You can see how much slop those have. And honestly, this chain could have lasted longer if the rollers were in better shape. So that's the one downfall of a seal chain, is it does not seal these rollers here, and those will wear out much faster than the actual links themselves. So if anyone wants to come up with a killer chain design, find a way to seal off these rollers and the chain will last even longer. So I wanted to show the difference between an O-ring and X-ring seal, because that's really the biggest difference here. The rest of the chain is basically the same. This is what is different here. So we have an O-ring from an O-ring chain, and the X-ring, the reason why they call it an X is because it has 2 lips on the outer diameter and 2 lips on the inner. So when you look at it from the side, it looks kind of like an X. You can see the difference here. Now, why it makes such a big difference is because with the O-ring, you have a much larger surface area that is rubbing against the plates, which equates to more friction, more drag, and therefore less power. With the X-ring, you just have these outer lip and the inner lip that is basically hitting on the plates or sealing against the plates. So with the X-ring design, that results in about 30 or 40% less friction than the O-ring design, which is insane to me. Another difference here with these 2 rings is the ability to seal out water and dirt and keep in the grease. So with the X-ring, it has those 2 lips, which do a really good job keeping in the grease. You can kind of see right there, there's already grease inside that groove, whereas the O-ring does not retain the grease very well. And so you're gonna get much longer life out of an X-ring chain because of that. So I want to show you guys how much a chain wears over time. We have a used standard non-seal chain and a new out-of-the-box X-ring chain. You can see that used chain is pretty worn laterally. It really sags. While we're talking about chain wear, let's compare these 4 chains and how much they've stretched. We have a standard non-sealed chain from a 2001 RM250, an O-ring chain from a 2003 CR250, an X-ring chain off of a CRF250, and then it was on a CR125, and then a brand new out-of-the-box X-ring chain. Now, I don't know how old these 2 chains are. These 2 chains were off of bikes that I had bought from someone else. This chain I bought brand new 9 years ago about, ran it on my personal bike. It's time for a new one, so I thought this would be a perfect comparison between the 4. Let's go ahead and pull all these chains tight. I would say these 3 used chains are in need of replacement, so it'll be interesting to see how they stack up. This is the standard chain, O-ring, and X-ring. So it's pretty evident to see how these chains wore. Standard chain is about a link longer than the 2 used seal chains. The O-ring and X-ring chains are pretty much equivalent. Now keep in mind, all of these chains are 112 links. I counted them out. And the new chain is about a link and a half shorter than the used seal chains, while the standard chain it's about 3 links longer than the new chain. So yeah, it's crazy to see how much this standard chain stretched over the years. Obviously, we don't know how long these chains have been used on a bike or what kind of bike they were on or how well they were maintained. Now, there's not a lot we can deduct here because we don't know the life that these 2 chains have been through. I do know this one. I bought it new and ran it on my bike for 9 years before I took it off literally today for this video. It doesn't seem like it stretched a whole lot, only a link and a half over 9 years, which is actually pretty solid, a lot better than I thought it was going to be. These rollers are pretty loose, so I was expecting it to be like 3 links longer. And this chain here, I kept up on it really well. I always made sure it was lubricated and adjusted perfectly. So it appears like a seal chain holds up pretty decent. It's hard to say, but I would say a standard chain definitely did not hold up quite as well. It stretched about twice as much as a seal chain. Anyways, I thought this was interesting and thought I'd lay out the chains and see how they stacked up. Thought I would check these rollers and see how they compare. New chain is nice and tight, rolls smoothly obviously. Used X-ring, that's pretty loose. Doesn't really want to roll. Used O-ring, doesn't really want to roll either, but it's not as loose as the X-ring was. And the standard, it rolls, but I'd say that's pretty loose too. Looser than the O-ring. And obviously, like I said before, we don't know how long these 2 chains have been used, but I bet you not as long as this X-ring. And what's interesting about that is even though the X-ring's rollers are way more loose than the O-ring, they still stretched about the same amount. So that leads me to believe the X-ring chain has had a lot more years of use compared to these 2, and it still stretched the same amount as the O-ring and stretched a lot less than the standard. Also, another thing too is look at the play in the standard chain. The O-ring, tiny bit. The X-ring, a little bit as well. And so even though the rollers are wearing out on these chains, the pins are still holding tight. Now you'll notice on sealed chains, the rollers are still going to wear just like any other chain. That is because the actual rollers are not sealed. It is only the plate to the link that is sealed. So as you can see on this chain here, so we have the seal, then the plate. So that seal only seals off the plate to the link. It does not seal the actual roller there. So a good indicator of how long a chain has been used is the roller wear. This one is extremely floppy there. So this chain has a ton of hours on it, like I mentioned. It's got 9 years on it. These chains don't appear to have quite as much. So you'll notice the difference between this chain, which is a non-sealed, has a lot of play, and a sealed, this one's tight. Those seals protect those pins and links from wearing out, and that is essentially how a chain stretches, is all these pins wear out, it stretches out, and then all of a sudden you have a chain that is about 1.5 inches longer than a new one. So things to look out for when you're replacing a chain is obviously how tight the links are, and then how tight the rollers are. We've got a lot of play in these. So obviously this chain's toast, this chain is toast. This O-ring actually seems like is pretty solid. I bet you it has fairly low hours on it because these rollers are kind of tight, but they're just rusted and corroded and they're not really wanting to spin well. So a seal chain really only protects your chain from stretching like this. This one's pretty loose. It does not protect your rollers from wearing out. Those need to be lubricated with chain lube, which is why maintenance is so important on these. And also why when you replace your sprockets, you need to replace the chain as well in most cases. If you have loose rollers like this, that is going to wear your sprockets out right away because the fitment from the chain to the sprocket is going to be loose, and that is just going to notch those sprockets out in a hurry. While I have these chains laid out, thought I'd show you the difference in drag. Standard chain is really loose and free moving. Probably because it's so worn out too, but it is pretty free, brand new as well. A O-ring, definitely way more stiff. This one's rusted, so it's not that great of a representation. If we stick it up like that, it'll hold its shape. The used X-ring, a little bit more free, still pretty sticky. A lot more stiction than the standard chain. If we hold it up, it'll keep its shape. The new X-ring, more free, probably because it's well lubricated. If we stick it up, it'll fall down. So you can see the difference there in drag. Now as far as weight goes, we have 3 different chains here: a standard chain, a O-ring chain, and an X-ring chain, all 112 links. So let's set them on the scale and compare, because obviously that's one of the biggest debates between chains. So the standard chain with no O-rings at all is 60.4 ounces. And we have the O-ring chain, has O-rings in between the links and the plates. 61.9, so just a hair heavier. And we have this X-ring chain, Pro X, 60.5. Wow, that is actually the same weight as the standard chain. Now obviously brand matters here too, because some brands have different specs with their thicknesses and materials and whatnot. These two are Renthal chains. This one's a Pro X, like I mentioned, so honestly pretty comparable between the 3. Just the O-ring chain was, what was it, an ounce or 2 heavier. Now just for comparison's sake, just to show how much a difference brands plays into the weight factor here, is I have a standard chain, Pro X. This is a non-sealed, non-O-ring chain. Now it is 120 links and it is a brand new chain, so I don't want to cut it down to 112. But we can calculate it down per link, so that is 63 ounces. Now, if that was 112 links, that would be, let's do some math here. Divided by 120, 0.52 ounces per link times 112. So this would actually be basically 59 ounces. So lighter than any of these chains here. So when it comes down to it, a X-ring or O-ring chain, provided you're using the same brand, is about an ounce or ounce and a half heavier, obviously if they're the same length. And that equates to about 3 links, since each link is about half an ounce. While I had this chain out, I thought I'd just measure the thicknesses, since that's a factor as well. The X-ring is 17.17 and the standard is 15.3. So about, or a little less than 2 millimeter difference. So that is why some of the seal chains, you'll run into clearance issues. They'll rub on the crankcase. Each one of these chains has its place. No chain is perfect for all applications. Now the standard chain is probably best for smaller displacement bikes. So anything 125cc and smaller, I would probably run a standard chain. because it is lighter. You're not going to lose as much horsepower there, and it's not going to quite stretch as much. Now the O-ring chain is going to be your kind of old school seal type chain. The X-ring chain is more of a newer design. O-ring has been around for 60, 70 years. X-ring is probably within the last 10, I would say. So the O-rings are going to be cheaper. So it is going to still give you that seal design, longer life, but you're going to be kind of fighting against a heavier chain with more friction and more drag. Now, if you want the longest lasting chain possible, the X-ring is the way to go. So in my experience and what I've seen online with other people too, is an X-ring lasts about twice as long as your O-ring and up to like 3 or 4 times longer than your standard chain. Obviously that depends on the quality of the chain and how well you maintain it, but the design here just is the best it gets as far as like sealing out water and dirt. And so in my experience, I've run an X-ring on both my bikes. On my 125, I really haven't noticed that big of a power loss either. So I'm perfectly comfortable running an X-ring chain on a 125. And one other factor to consider here is the style of riding that you do. If you're purely track and you're looking for just the most horsepower possible, go for a standard chain. That's what all the race teams run, professional racing. They want to reduce as much drag as possible, and they don't really care about the lifespan of the chain. Most off-road guys run a seal chain like an O-ring or X-ring. Those hold up a lot better in the conditions like with the mud and rain and kind of deep ruts and stuff like that. Now the only downfall to the X-ring chain is the cost. It is a bit pricier than the other style chains. I would say it's about 20% more than your standard chain and about 10% more than your O-ring chain. So you can expect these to be anywhere from say $90 to $120 for an X-ring. Now the quality of your chain has a big impact as well. If you're using a cheaper chain, even if it's sealed, it may not last as long. If you're using a top quality chain, obviously you're gonna get the most life out of it. And of course, another thing to think about too is a cheaper chain, you run the risk of snapping it or derailing it, causing damage to your bike or possibly injuring yourself. If a chain snaps on the face of a jump, like we've seen in racing sometimes, that can cause some pretty significant injuries. So I would recommend buying the highest quality chain that you can afford. I mean, on this bike in particular, everything is kind of like on a budget status. I refinished a lot of parts. I didn't really put a lot of money into it. The one area that I'm really putting money into is the chain and sprockets. I'm not going to skimp on that. If you have a chain problem, that is going to result in a lot of bike damage and possibly injuries. Now, in my opinion and experience, the Pro X chains are some of the best chains that money can buy. I've run them on a few different bikes now and always been impressed with them, had some good life out of them. They come straight from Japan using some really high quality steel. And what's unique about the Pro X chains is they have these holes for reducing some of the weight there. As you saw on the scale, these weighed out really good in comparison to the other chains. So that is why I am running a Pro X chain on this build, not really wanting to compromise in that area. And that is also why I stock these chains on the store. So that is about as detailed as I'm gonna get with chains. Hopefully that made sense for you guys and made your buying decisions a little easier, along with all the variables that go along with chains and sprockets. Now, if you want a good quality chain at a solid price, Pro X are the way to go. These are gonna last you a long time, especially the X-ring chains. The standard chains are really solid too if you want a chain that's not going to eat up as much power. These are available on the store. Like I said earlier, if you want a cheap chain, just hit up eBay or maybe that Wish app. I'm sure they got some good ones. But anyways, that's the video for you guys. Hope you enjoyed this one. Maybe learned a thing or two. I'll see you in the next one. Fuck off.